Presenter today is Dr. Michael Jacobson, who's a professor of forest resources in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management at Penn State University. Dr. Jacobson carries out extension, research, and teaching programs that promote sustainable management of forests and other natural resources. The courses he teaches cover forest economics, agroforestry, and international forestry. He is a contributor to both the Extension and Human Systems thrusts within New Bio, a Pennsylvania Biomass Energy Association, or PBEA, board director, a member of the Forest Service-funded Pennsylvania State Wood Energy Team, which I mentioned before, and a past president of the Association for Temperate Agroforestry. Mike's talk today examines linkages between an important agroforestry practice, developing riparian buffers, and developing the broader bioeconomy. So Mike, we're looking forward to diving deeper into this topic. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Sarah, and hope everyone can hear me well. If not, please type in the chat box or type your questions as we go along, as Sarah mentioned. Well, it's great to be here today. As Sarah mentioned, and you've probably seen from our New Bio website, that we are on the quest to develop liquid fuels from energy crops, cellulosic energy. But as the market develops, we look for alternative ways to make money from growing energy crops, and ecosystem services has become one of those areas. So what I've tried to do is think about riparian buffers, which I've worked on for quite a while, and the new area of energy crops, and bring them together by them providing ecosystem services. So that's the thrust of my presentation. And Patrick Bowman, I put as a co-author. He's a recently graduated master's here who did his work on riparian buffers and nutrient credit trading. And so he has a lot of input into this presentation. So what I'm going to cover is mainly three parts. Why are buffers important, and why should we be considering them for water quality and ecosystem services, and then maybe for energy crops. And then what are the incentives out there for buffers, of which nutrient credit trading is important as one of the incentive programs. And then how can energy crops fit into this? Just for those not too familiar with our New Bio project, the three main energy crops we're working on are two warm season grasses, very high yielding grasses, miscanthus and switchgrass, and a short rotation woody crop, shrub willow, which produces high yielding wood fiber on a 3-year rotation. So the focus of our work in this region is obviously the Chesapeake Bay, and Pennsylvania is a large part of that. And Chesapeake Bay, through the EPA, has been listed as impaired waters since 1988. And one of the main reasons for that is eutrophication, which is the excess fertilizers creating algae, which compete for sunlight and other food plants that are part of the food chain, so limiting the, environmental benefits delivered into the Chesapeake Bay. So total mean daily limits, or TMDLs, were instituted in 2010 in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and the goal, which I'm focusing on, is nitrogen, but there are other inputs into the bay, or pollution, I should say, like phosphorus and sediment, but I'll talk a little bit about those later, but I'm focusing on nitrogen. And the goal there is a 25% reduction by 2025. And as you can see from that chart, agriculture is the main source of nitrogen pollution entering the bay. That diagram on the right is a bit old. It had 30% contributing from agriculture, and I've seen later numbers of 40 to 42%, meaning it's actually going up. And whether the other sources of pollution, be it wastewater, treatment plants, sewage plants, or municipal stormwater, which are the other two main contributors, are actually reducing their contribution is another story. The other thing of note, as you can see, is that Pennsylvania is the largest contributor of nitrogen, and that's mainly because of our agricultural production in the Susquehanna Bay watershed. Okay, so I see some some mic issues. Maybe that's a little better. It's one of those headphone mics. All right, so I developed this conceptual model to help you think about what I'm talking about here. And if you look on the far right, obviously our goal or our target is the health of the Chesapeake Bay. And the problem or threats are nutrient pollution. And to keep it simple, they're coming from three main sources: wastewater treatment plants, municipal stormwater, and then agriculture, mainly crop and dairy production. By the way, forestry, timber harvesting is a very, very minor percentage of, and it's mainly sediment that would reach the bay, and so it's sort of a non-factor. And so we have these three threats and ways to deal with them. One of the ones is nutrient credit trading, which is going on in the Bay watershed states. Pennsylvania has its own program, and that's mainly targeted at wastewater treatment plants. But all three of these threats, municipal stormwater hasn't really caught on to the nutrient credit trading yet, but it's going to be coming down the line, and that's going to be a big player later on with nutrient credit trading. So from the agriculture perspective, we can look at payment for ecosystem services, which I'll define in a minute, as a way to reduce this pollution. And riparian buffers is one of the suite of tools that we can use to reduce nutrients like nitrogen into the bay. I mean, other tools available are restoring wetlands, cover crops, no-till agriculture, and things like that. So when we talk about riparian buffers, there's three main activities or incentive programs: the nutrient credit trading, which I'll talk about. I'll also talk about CREP, which is the Conservation Reserve Enhancement Program, and it's a cost-share program to the government. And then what we're interested in through New Bio is using energy crops grown on buffers, and obviously biomass markets are important to have that market for the energy crops. Okay, so ecosystem services, broadly defined, are all the benefits people obtain from ecosystem services, and you can see a suite from, for example, timber to purely aesthetics. And the important thing is putting a price on these ecosystem services. So things that are tangible, that are products like timber or recreation, we can price. But when you get to things like aesthetics and just enjoying the environment, some of these are non-marketable. So we have trouble putting prices on them, but they're really valuable. And so that's why payment for these ecosystem services has been developed, where people who demand those ecosystem services, like society at large, would pay the landowner, the farmer, to reduce to provide those ecosystem services, for example, through reduced nitrogen runoff. And if we look at values for the Chesapeake Bay, we see estimates of over $100 billion from these ecosystem services. And we also see from some literature that there's billions of dollars worth of environmental degradation which is affecting the bay, as I mentioned, from this nutrient pollution entering the bay. That diagram on the bottom right there is economists trying to value ecosystem services, and you can see the types of ecosystem services, and we're talking about $33 trillion estimated, which is huge. It's over double the world's gross national product. So riparian buffers, okay, so they provide water quality and stream ecology. I'll get more into that. And specialty products, which is the diagram on the right. So if we look at this buffer diagram, we can see that it's broken up into different kind of zones. And the typical or the recommended U.S. Department of Agriculture is this three-zone approach, where you have sort of a grass filter strip right towards the cropland edge, and then a row of trees, and then towards the water you have sort of native vegetation, or restoring native vegetation. That's called the three-zone riparian model. So there is a lot of buffer work going on in the region, and for better or worse, some of it is in this three-zone, but very little of it actually replicates this. So coming from the energy crop perspective, we'd be thinking of that row of trees as where we would be planting the energy crops. And if we do the grass filter strips, that would be a combination of the grasses and perhaps the willow. There has been a fair amount of work being done on providing incentives for buffers just beyond the water quality. And so, what kind of products can we get out of buffers? And even back to 1999, some work has been done by people at University of Maryland where they created these buffer zones. So you can see that the serviceberry, bee balm, and elderberries would be close to the water, and then the nut trees, the filbert and the pecans, would be back towards the actually the filbert and the pecans would be towards the water. So they create these different scenarios for different products that could be harvestable from buffers, so nut trees, berries, medicinal plants, things like that, and they actually had willow in their systems. And if you read this paper, you'll see they talk about $60,000 of net present value from these products. Now, as far as I know, and someone could correct me, I don't know anyone who's really making marketable products at any extent from riparian buffers at present. But there are people producing crops in riparian buffers, but I haven't seen really as a commercially viable as a standalone enterprise like these guys in this paper try to write about. So, but if we think about energy crops and markets, that could become a viable commercial enterprise. So typically, and the diagram on the last slide was a forested buffer, but you could also have a grass filter strip, which is basically a densely packed grass. And these are two recognized buffer types through the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Now, how effective are they? Well, the whole point of buffers is to reduce the nitrogen. The plants uptake the nitrogen. There's microbial denitrification, where the material is absorbed by the microbes and released to the air, so it doesn't enter the water. And then the soil and the groundwater and the roots also absorb the nitrogen or phosphorus and prevent it from reaching the water streams. Now, comparing forest and grass filter strips, the literature talks about, because of tree roots and the carbon content in the plant material in trees, absorbing nitrogen better than do forest grass buffers in general. But obviously, it all depends on the buffer's effectiveness depends on the vegetative composition, the soil characteristics, the slopes, the hydrology of the watershed, the climate, and then obviously the buffer work. Okay. So here's just a couple of photos. You can see the benefits of buffers with the shade overlying the stream, providing shade for fish habitat. You can see down woody debris in the streams, providing also fish habitat and microecosystems. And then you probably see so the last were sort of natural buffers, but we've tried to restore and create buffers, and we see a lot of these. So before and after with tree tubes. And thinking about the 3-zone scenario and the time it would take for buffers to establish when we talk about 80-year rotations for our native hardwoods that are planted in these tree tubes, we're talking a long time to really see the maximum benefits of the ecosystem services from buffers. And so with these fast-growing energy crops, we might be able to see results much faster than planting these natural hardwoods. But I'm not opposed to that. I think in combination we can see it. It's just that the natural hardwoods would take a long time to grow. So what incentives are out there to encourage buffer establishment? Well, the most common one right now is, although farmers are doing it on their own, there was a recent survey done of Pennsylvania farmers, and they showed about 5,000 acres of buffers actually being grown by farmers on their own without any incentive programs, which was great to see. But that is a drop in the bucket for what's really needed. So there are government cost share programs. I mentioned CREP. There's also the Environmental Quality Incentive Program, EQIP, that provides quite a bit of establishment cost and rental payments to create buffers. There's nutrient credit trading, which I'll focus on in a few minutes. And then, the third activity that I had in the conceptual model was these energy crops. But we have to have the market. So let me just talk a little bit about CREP, CREP. And, it does pay a substantial percentage of the buffer establishment cost. In fact, if you get these bonus payments, that could actually pay for the whole thing and more. So you get over 100% of the establishment cost. You also get a rental payment for 10 to 15 years. And that is an issue, which I'll elaborate on in the next slide, because what happens to the buffer after that 10 to 15-year period expires? However, under CREP, you can't harvest for income your materials in the buffer, which would obviously have to change if we wanted to promote energy crops. Every state is different with their programs, but that's the case for Pennsylvania. And then there are a plethora of other rules. For example, if you wanted to enroll in CREP, you couldn't also get nutrient credits. And that's something I want to try and talk about, because I think these co-benefits or bundling incentives is really the way to go. And then you can see other rigid requirements, as I call them, through the NRCS and the Farm Services Agreement, where you need to, space them at designated spacings for the trees, and you need to put in these tree tubes. There are problems with tree tubes, and this is one of the extension publications I've written that talk about issues with tree tubes. They have their benefits, for example, to protect from deer browse, but they also have their negative sides from stunting tree growth, limiting branching, birds nesting in there, and things like that. So, and voles getting in, and so there are some issues with tree tubes that we need to address. And the question of the 10 to 15-year period where a landowner or farmer can automatically go and take their buffer out after that period, after they've gotten all this money, and put it back into row crops like corn, especially if the corn prices go up. So I had a student a while ago do a project with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation to look at, are there people who'd like to put a conservation easement on their buffers? And you can see there was some interest. The fact that 20% said yes was quite important. A conservation easement would ensure that the buffers stay a buffer in perpetuity. And most people did say they would leave their buffer intact, but I'm sure there's quite a few out there who would think that they would like to switch over, especially if agricultural crop prices increase. So that's an issue that needs to be addressed as well. So dealing with the water quality issues in the Bay, Pennsylvania, as I mentioned, is a little bit behind the other states in meeting some of these TMDLs. And so the state has created this Pennsylvania Riparian Forest Buffer Initiative, which is great, with the intention of adding 95,000 acres of buffers by 2025. And that's no trivial task. So incentives is the name of the game, and funding. And it's interesting to note that the secretary said buffers is probably the single best way to restore and reduce the pollution in our waterways. So that's good to hear, versus cover crops, versus restored wetlands, and also grass filter strips, which is another type of buffer, but not a forested buffer. Okay, so let me talk about the nutrient credit trading program and whether the nitrogen credits would be an incentive for farmers to establish buffers. So each state and watershed has a program. They're all different. The DEP, the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection, manages our program in Pennsylvania. And the basic idea is like a cap and trade where the polluter, the wastewater treatment plant in this case, the point pollution source, would buy credits from someone who's reducing their pollution, like the farmer with a cover crop, with a buffer, and the wastewater treatment plant would buy those credits because they over polluting, they're not meeting their requirements, and so they have to go buy credits from somewhere else. So there's exchange of credit marketing, and it's a way that DEP and other regulators can get a handle on the amount of load reaching the bay. Now, it is quite complicated. The producers, the farmers, need to meet some baselines to produce credits, which in many cases are already some conservation practices like no-till or something like that to meet that baseline before you can even start to generate credits. It's a performance-based approach, so it's based on what you're actually performing, so the amount of credits you actually produce, not just what the practice is. And there is some process, some transaction costs, as we call it, for the farmer to get enrolled. They need to be certified, verified, and registered. And there's an online system that's run by some private companies that carry out auctioning of these credits. Now, most of the credits are wastewater treatment plants buying credits between themselves. And so about 800,000 nitrogen credits were sold in 2014. But only about 12% of those came from farm-related best management practices, and even a very smaller percent came from riparian buffers. So most of it is trading between the wastewater treatment plants right now, but we would like to obviously see more farmers being enrolled, and dealing with some of these transaction costs is important. But obviously the price of credits is important, and that's what my student Patrick tried to tackle by addressing, whether it would pay to establish buffers. So how do they calculate the credits? So I just made this little diagram to show you that it's basically you apply nitrogen to the field, plants uptake a certain percentage, and then you get the amount of nitrogen reaching the edge of field. And then there's something called the edge of stream or edge of watershed segment, which is a ratio of the nutrients reaching the edge of the field. And that's a calculation that's done through the Chesapeake Bay model and some other calculations. So you get that number, and so that's the amount that reaches the stream. And then you also subtract the delivery ratio, that because obviously your field is not right by the bay, and the delivery ratio is the amount that actually reaches the bay. Well, it's a factor, a ratio that goes into that, and it's obviously related to the location of the field. Let me just check a couple of questions here. In PA, is a credit a fixed amount of nitrogen reduction? Yeah, one credit is 1 pound of nitrogen reduction, Peter. And one nitrogen credit refers to one. Oh, thanks, Pat. All right, so that's how it works. That's how the calculation works in Pennsylvania anyway. And the idea, obviously, is to have that buffer uptake more of the nitrogen before it reaches the stream. That's the whole concept. So what Patrick did was he created some models, and with different schemes of buffers. The traditional buffer for CREP funding has to be at least 35 feet, can't be more than 100 feet. So we decided to have three types of buffers, 30 feet, 50 feet, and 100 feet, on either side of a stream. And we used a 100-acre field as our scenario, and the stream running down the middle. We looked at 6 different counties in Pennsylvania across the watershed. So you can see there Lancaster is much closer to the bay than is Tioga County in the north. And so we could get the location differences. And also the farming prices and the corn prices are different, as you'll see in a minute. And then if you look carefully, you can see the watershed segments and the delivery ratios are very different across those counties. And so in addition, in the buffer scenarios, we have the geographical location I mentioned, the 100-acre field. We used both grass buffer and grass filter strips in our scenarios. And we also looked at conventional and no-till farming methods. The nitrogen credit calculation spreadsheets are available from the DEP, and I see there's a question from Patricia about nutrient credit trading programs. Yeah, we can get you the website. There is a link to DEP where it talks about the program. And each state has Virginia and Maryland anyway have them as well. And nitrogen credit prices, so that's key. And they've been ranging, as you know, I mentioned it's an auction, so it's market prices, and they've ranged from $1 to $5. Right now, I just checked, and they're $2.51. And in Patrick's study last year, we used $3 as a bit of it's actually, you know, very seldom has it reached $3, so it's actually quite a conservative number. And then the reduction factors, those delivery ratios and so on, they come from a Chesapeake Bay watershed model, which is a big EPA-related model. The main problem with this model for estimating credits from buffers, it's linear. So it does take into effect really changes in buffer size from the perspective of, you know, it's all linear, so that, you know, if you add another foot of buffer, you get another X amount of nutrient credits. So we all know that, you know, adding more buffers, it sort of ends up where there's an optimal buffer size, and there's also probably, you know, a minimal size. But if you had a 1 foot buffer, you would still get credits, because that's how the model works. So it is problematic for looking at marginal costs and things like that, and so we'd like to look at improving this model to be more realistic for buffer sizes and locations, etc. So what we did was we looked at credit production costs, which is sort of also examining break-even prices. We looked at opportunity costs of corn, which is, you know, the farmers are giving up land area to put in the buffer that they could grow their corn on. So we have to look at the cost of that corn that they're giving up as a cost of establishing the buffer. And then we also looked at scenarios where they got reimbursed for cost share programs as well. So a few results. So looking across all the counties, the mean nitrogen credit production costs. So we have 4 groupings there. We have forest buffers with conventional and no-till, and we have the grass buffers, conventional and no-till, at the different sizes of the buffers. And the red line is the $3 credit price. So what you see here basically is that the forest buffers, to produce a credit, are much higher than the break-even $3 price, ranging from $30 to $15, depending on the size and the type of practice. You're probably asking, why is no-till more costly than conventional? Well, that's one of the curiosities or ironies of the model, because no-till, you're already reducing nitrogen to the edge of the field. So that means to actually get a credit of nitrogen, you have to produce more area, and so it's going to cost more. So the more conventional, the more you pollute, actually the lower the cost it is to produce a credit of nitrogen. So that's an anomaly with the model. So basically, because it's a linear model, what you see is that, you know, the buffer prices increase with, the credit prices increase with buffer size. On the grass side, you can see that they are close to the $3 credit price, and so there you're just planting grasses, and so there's not a lot of establishment costs involved, and that's why they could be economical. So that's the mean production costs. And then if you look at across the counties, if you remember the map, Tioga County is way in the north, far from the bay, and so to produce a credit from buffers in those situations would be a lot more costly than if you go towards the buffer, like for Lancaster County. And what's interesting is actually Center County, which is further away than Lebanon or Cumberland or Lancaster actually has a high edge of stream ratio segment. And so that actually makes its costs or producing a nitrogen credit relatively low. And I'm sure it has something to do with the topography, the cost, and the importance of our watershed, well, because we in Center County here at Penn State, to make it lower cost. So that's interesting. But the general trends are there. The forested buffers cost a lot more than the grass filter strips at all scenarios. And as you can see, as you get closer to the bay, the grass filter strips become economical and is sometimes below the $3 current credit price. So if we add the opportunity cost of growing corn, that's the lighter green, you can see not a lot different, but it does have an impact, and obviously the size of the buffer affects the loss of corn that's being grown. But again, from the forested buffer side, it doesn't make much of a dent to get below the break-even $3. If we look at the grass filter strips, when we take into the opportunity cost of corn, we see actually a bigger impact, because that's also related to the lower costs of establishing the buffers with just grasses, and so the opportunity costs of corn would be higher in those cases. And so you see they still a little bit above the $3, but we're getting close. If we look at the establishment cost reimbursements with the forested buffer, and we used the CREP information, we also looked at alternative buffer establishments where we didn't use sort of what we call the more expensive CREP approach. CREP approach is about $1,700 an acre to establish a buffer, and you can see that with the cost share, it was quite substantially lower. And with the grass filter strips and cost share reimbursements, you can see that a lot of it did get down to below the $3 market price. So what is an optimal price? And you can see, so it ranges from say $20, $30 with buffers to even $50 in some cases, like in Tioga County, down to a few dollars with the grass filter strips. There was work done by the World Resources Institute, Cy Jones, who came up with a $20 break-even price that's needed for a credit to make buffers profitable. And so keep that $20 in mind. We're talking $3 right now. So just a summary of that study. There's a lot more of it. If you're interested, I can send you more information in the thesis. It's going to be published soon. Grass filter strips may be profitable. Buffers in all scenarios were not profitable. However, they do provide greater nitrogen reduction, and they do provide more ecosystem benefits. So nitrogen trading alone isn't sufficient as a payment for ecosystem services for nitrogen reduction. But as market prices increase for credits, so will credit supply. Farmers will be more willing to supply them. And what's going on right now is it's mostly driven by the wastewater treatment plants, the credit trading, but there is a lot of talk in the next 5 years that municipal stormwater systems will have to come into compliance. And when they join the credit trading market, we're going to see a lot of demand, demand for credits, and so hopefully that could increase prices. The other question is dealing with those transaction costs the farmers have to deal with, and so bundling and aggregation is important for farmers to be involved. And of course, price will depend on a number of factors, so it's what the farmer will get. It depends on where they are located with respect to the bay. So what we're thinking of is, I didn't talk about phosphorus or sediment payments, but maybe that would make it more economical. We need to talk about bundling it with other government cost share programs. Non-timber forest products like ginseng or nut trees or fruit trees could provide markets to make it profitable. And then what I want to end up talking about is energy crops. So I did some looking around to see, what's out there with buffers and energy crops. And Sweden has had a long-term trial growing. Well, Sweden has the most willow of any country in the world, and they've done quite a bit of work on buffers, and there are quite a few papers out there where they're using it to spray wastewater, and they're also using it as buffers. And so they do show that when they spray it and it goes through this vegetation filter, the willow, the nitrate concentration in the groundwater was greatly reduced, as was energy savings instead of pumping that water or transporting it somewhere else. So that was good. And in Canada, Prince Edward Island, I couldn't get too much information off the web, but they've experimented with buffers. I don't know any of the results, but you can see some photos here. So that's about the extent of it that I've found in terms of energy crops potentially in buffers. And I also should just mention that new bio team members led by Peter Woodbury, who's actually on the webinar, did a study where we not only look at buffers, but we look at replacing maize in the entire watershed with switchgrass, one of our energy crops. And you can see that, with a target of the $25 million pounds of nitrogen being suggested, you can see that with switchgrass, it could make quite a big impact into meeting some of these targets compared to cover crops with maize, and just maize, even the best management practices. And if we translate that switchgrass into energy, and we can see upwards of 420 million gallons of ethanol being produced from that ethanol, which can obviously contribute to liquid ethanol, gasoline in our region. So the key is the market price. I mean, farmers would probably grow it and be interested in it if they could get a decent price for their biomass. So I had another student who's done some work on growing these energy crops, and she did a survey, and you can see that farmers would be wanting around $140 a ton for their biomass energy crops, all things being equal. We've done some work ourselves on techno-financial analysis, budget spreadsheets, enterprise budgets, and other universities as well, and you can see a range of $28 to $60 per ton break-even prices from some of our modeling work. And then you talk to the industry, and they want to pay, around $50 a ton for the cellulosic feedstocks, the energy crops. So there's a huge price gap. And so, we have to be trying to make energy crops more economical for the bioenergy refineries to want to purchase, and more cost-effective and less production costs for the farmers to want to produce it. And so that's one of the challenges that we're working on with New Bio. So the market is pretty important. So that's the extent of energy crops. So I hope I've sort of created this picture of how buffers as an ecosystem service can provide a service, especially if it's done through energy crop production, if there's a market. And as more demand for nitrogen pollution increases, we could see ag, because technically they could supply it at lower cost than any other way, because there's a limit to how much wastewater treatment plants and municipal stormwater systems can actually reduce their pollution. And if we grow energy crops in buffers, it will add value, and it would reduce costs to the farmer, because they would get the market benefits from selling the crop products, the feedstock. There are some issues, and I mentioned Peter Woodbury's analysis. He's going to be doing a webinar in May on that switchgrass replacing maize study. And obviously, when we do that, there are issues with food supply prices and leakage. Where are we going to grow our corn? And so we need to think about that as well. And then if we are going to put rows of trees and willow or switchgrass and be harvesting it regularly along a stream course, using machinery, using herbicides, we have to think logistically about the impacts of those activities. And then finally, obviously, it's the market for the bioenergy. It's really a chicken and egg, as you saw from the last diagram. You know, the growers won't risk it until they know there's a market, and the producers don't really want to invest until they know they got a supply. So that's what we're working on with New Bio. And so we need to find ways for growers to get a higher price. If they can combine these ecosystem service nutrient credits with energy crops, markets, we could see a win-win, and we can lower pollution into the bay and also create this bioeconomy that we're all interested in. So with that, I'll stop and turn it back to Sarah to moderate any questions.
Thanks, Mike. That was a great overview. It looks like we have a couple of people typing questions in, but if I could maybe circle back to Peter's initial question. So you talk through the calculations of nutrient credits for Pennsylvania, but can you give a little bit more practical detail what the on-the-ground measurement and verification looks like? Or is it sort of just a pre-established calculation, like you said, based on linear feet of buffer? If there's something more to it, who's doing the measurement at what intervals to run these calculations? You still with us, Mike? I think you may be muted.
Yep, I was muted. You told me to mute between when you're talking. So yeah, so it's actually very simple. It's a spreadsheet that you can get, and you put in your numbers, and yeah, there's no real, as far as I know, a lot of ground truthing on the actual measuring nitrogen reaching the stream. So it's all these calculations based on your location, the geography, distance from the bay, you know, the type of tillage practices you're doing. All those calculations get plugged into the spreadsheet, and out pops the number of nitrogen credits that you can get from that scenario. So it's, yeah, it's pretty superficial. Put it one way.
So with evolving strategies for building buffers with more diverse functionality on the landscape, will there be future opportunities to change some of the parameters associated with that? Can we expect any corresponding changes in the way nutrient credits are calculated and estimated with the understanding that some of these different types of functionality is being tried with perennial crops and other systems?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, right now it's just, actually, there's no nutrient credits for grass filter strips. We did it hypothetically, but so it's really this forested buffer scenario, which is sort of the 3-zone model, and obviously not a lot of people are really practicing that. So yeah, I think there's a lot of work, there's a lot of room for work in improving the model to deal with a lot of different types of buffer setups.
Okay, thanks. We'll get back to the questions that have just been posed for us here. Sorry for the diversion there. So Peter asks if you can talk about how transaction or verification costs affect the conclusions that you had for those two scenarios.
Well, we ignored those because that's actually a cost. Yeah, we didn't bring those into our calculations, but obviously the farmer would need to deal with those costs, which would obviously affect the net production cost that I talked about. So technically it would increase it. So we didn't internalize it in our model, but yeah, it should be internalized obviously by the farmer when they're looking at producing buffers.
So let's keep diving a bit deeper into establishment cost. When you talked about the forested versus the grass buffer scenarios, I'm curious about the primary drivers of those establishment costs, with the forested buffers being so much larger. Is that largely a labor issue, a planting stock issue? I imagine these comparisons would change, as one of our participants is asking, with the scale or size or capacity of the producer, if you are looking to do some active management in that buffer system. So how does scale affect that? What are the biggest drivers of those costs?
With buffers, there's very strict requirements on number of trees, tree tubes. Trees can cost hundreds of dollars, depending on the type of tree. I mean, obviously we're talking maybe $20, $30 a tree. We've got the tree tubes. There's a lot more installation costs and labor involved in riparian forested buffers, so that increases the cost substantially. We did look in our study at alternative buffer costs, not the CREP one that we used, that I showed you in those diagrams, and it did reduce it to about $1,000 an acre versus $1,700 an acre, but it still would, in those scenarios, which I didn't show the graphs, it would still be higher than the break-even $3. So yeah, I mean, size, we think about 100-foot buffers being much more effective. Obviously, it's much more costly, and unfortunately, the model, because it's a linear model, didn't really take into effect size as much as we'd like to see, and so that's another thing we'd like to fix up with the nutrient credit trading model Pennsylvania uses.
So how does logistics fit into that? Patricia asked a question about looking at the logistics of harvesting bioenergy crops in buffer systems. I think her question wasn't specifically about economics, but one of the things we do talk about a lot with some of these perennial crops, willow especially, is high establishment costs due to machinery and specialized equipment needs. So I guess, could you answer that in two ways? First of all, as it pertains to the economics of establishment, and secondarily in the just practical logistics of moving that stuff around and getting things done with the management of those crops. I think you may be muted again.
I was. Yeah, it would be like any other harvesting that we're doing right now on regular fields, except it's linear strips. So you got to think about slopes at the water edge, how far we keep the energy crops away from the water. 35 feet of willow or grasses is not much harvestable, so it would depend on how many total acres of the material is there, how accessible it is, how linear it is. All these kind of questions would go into the logistics. And then there's obviously concerns, because when we grow these crops, we often use herbicides to treat them in the first year for establishment. And so that could be a factor for water quality. So there's a lot of things we'd need to address. But if we had this forested area along the water's edge, that could obviously appease a lot of those problems.
All right, we got another question come in. I assume the TMD limits and the ability to offset by purchasing credits are driven by regulations. What is the current status of these regulations, and will they be impacted by changes in federal administration? Probably this question has pertinence not just at the federal level, but with a lot of state regulations too, or multi-state consortia that specifically affect Chesapeake Bay. Can you talk a little bit about regulation forecasting? Maybe take.
Well, yeah. So I don't know. Go look at the Washington Post today. There's an article saying our EPA designee, Scott Pruitt, has already voted against Chesapeake Bay water nitrogen or TDMDL limits. So that, in a nutshell, that answers your question. But yeah, I mean, I think people in the Bay watershed, and if it does come down to the states, I think the states are very serious about controlling pollution, and so I don't see any, from a state perspective, any reduction in activities to address this issue. So the fact that the Pennsylvania government are really on board with adding hundreds of, tens of thousands of acres of buffers is really something to behold, and we want to work with them to make sure that happens. So all credit to them, and let's, I think just keep moving forward.
So our next question from Tom continues this vein of policy questions with a little bit more about chemical mechanisms here. So he says, Mike, you mentioned phosphorus, but only briefly. There's strong evidence that buffers accumulate phosphorus as we would want, but may also make it much more soluble as it cycles through plants and microbes. From a mass balance standpoint, buffers become a source of phosphorus instead of a sink, often within 5 years. Harvesting biomass would be one way to remove phosphorus from the system and maintain their effectiveness for the long term. How could this new science be addressed through policy?
As familiar with the chemistry, but yeah, it sounds like there's win-wins for buffers, win-wins for energy crops on buffers, given the issues with phosphorus. So I think everyone talks about nitrogen because that's the main problem with agriculture. Phosphorus is more from the wastewater, sewage, and so on, but also phosphorus from agriculture, but not as much, I don't think. So I think we need to be really, serious about bundling these credits and talking about the net benefits of reducing phosphorus, nitrogen, and sediments. So it's a matter of showing people these issues and why energy crops can be are actually needed if we want to actually deal with phosphorus. A very good point.
So Mike, the hypothesis that you've outlined here is an economic one, but the language that we use to describe these types of integrated buffer systems, multifunctional buffers, borrows a lot from forestry, from the concept of active and working forests, multifunctional forests. So I guess I'm going to ask you kind of to put on your human systems hat. You do some research with the new Biohuman Systems group, with the understanding that people make decisions based on economics, as well as this sort of smaller, what the socially available envelope of land is for certain types of activities. Do you see the sort of landowner attitudes and landowner decision-making factoring into this in a significant way that would either open up more of the land, as you had indicated earlier, that some people do even without incentives, or less based on the sort of baseline assumption of your economic scenario that you laid out? So Wes has posed a question to ask about how these buffered installation decisions are made by landowners or farmers who lease land.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's hard to answer. There's a lot to talk about. I think most landowners and farmers, from the studies we've seen, I mentioned my student, but other studies I've seen on buffers are, most of them are established for environmental benefits, more than the financial benefits, obviously. The CREP program does sweeten the pot quite substantially. So I think, you see the people installing buffers are very well-meaning, and they'd like to keep them, and so I do believe we would see, I think, with these public campaigns like the 95,000 acres and the more problems we see with the Chesapeake Bay and meeting these TMDLs and farmers becoming more involved and landowners becoming more aware of how buffers can work. I think the bottom line is we'll see more of them doing it. But it really does come down to affording it, and so that's where the incentives need to come in. And if we could create markets for energy crops, you can't ask for a better type of buffer because you're going to get returns very quickly compared to the traditional types of 3-zone buffers that are going in right now. So, you know, we could talk about this forever, but I do believe, you know, the literature and with forest owners and many farmers is they are good stewards of the land and like to see the right thing being done. And so those who are installing buffers do have that mindset.
So Wes's question.
I was just going to say, you know, I think we're scratching the surface. You know, we're talking hundreds of thousands of acres of buffers needed, and so we need a lot more of those type of people.
So Wes's question is a bit more refined than I had initially posed to you. He asks too about this point on how these decisions are made, whether they are made by the landowners, farmers who lease land. So there are a lot of sort of complicated land ownership or leasing arrangements that we see on the landscape that specifically affect riparian buffer areas. How's the sort of chain of command for those decision-making processes look?
You know, that gets into ownership questions, and there's a lot of leasing going on, and so, but I think, you know, I don't think, you know, with a depends on the lease period, right? I mean, if the leasee has over a certain amount of time, then they might make the decisions on what they can do. It's all about the contract with the leasee, but I think in general, the owners make these decisions, and as you saw from our study, most of them want to leave the buffer intact. And if I remember correctly, very few of the respondents we got were non-owners. But, you know, the question does become financial in the end about whether they want to keep the buffers. And if you drive around Pennsylvania and you see those tree tubes along the streams, and you say, great, they're installing a buffer, but, you know, my guess is a quarter of them, of those trees in those tree tubes are probably dead, and you know that doesn't look good. And a landowner or farmer gets discouraged when they see only survival rates of, you know, less than 50% on these buffers. When are my trees going to cover the stream? When's the canopy going to close? You know, so a lot of education, and again, that's where fast-growing energy crops that provide the nutrient benefits and markets for the farmers is a win-win.
So with that in mind as an additional incentive here, that whole concept, I mean, that's what we're talking about this whole time. Let me kind of use CREP as a specific example to focus in on that a little bit. With the landowners that you talk to who are currently engaged in the CREP program, with the understanding that your response will be anecdotal only, do you see frustration with the lack of options to harvest and market the product coming off of CREP land? And if so, do you think that the opportunity, an adjusted opportunity to actually use product that's coming off of land that has been set aside for some type of conservation incentive program, is that make it more likely that more people would engage in that practice?
So, of course. I mean, how would you like to be a farmer and not be able to make use of what you're growing on your land, or sell it? So the short answer is, yeah, I think that's obviously, you know, the Conservation Service has intentions because they feel that harvesting will detract from the environmental benefits, but I think there needs to be some compromise. And obviously, if we're going to grow energy crops, we're going to have to change the policies on what you can do if CREP is involved. And the other point is, you know, if I'm answering your question correctly, is that we need to deal with this problem of bundling incentives. You know, apparently you can't get into the nutrient credit trading program or get credits if you enrolled in a CREP program. So that defeats the whole purpose of establishing a buffer. And so landowners, you know, farmers would need to choose, you know, do I do a CREP or do I do a nutrient credit program? But really what we try to show is that CREP can create those incentives to make the buffer pay, and then you can get credits from that buffer. So we need to work on that as well.
So what are the appropriate avenues for advocacy of those few policy items, especially the bundling incentives aspect?
Good question. I think, talking to folks at NRCS and other institutions that make policy or, implement policy and getting it to those who make policy in Harrisburg or Washington. I do know that there are state ways, each state has their own ways to promulgate the practices, these conservation practices. So I don't think it'll be much to show the importance, but perhaps if you're just putting in a buffer for 80-year-old hardwood trees, there's no reason to worry about making income. But if you're doing switchgrass right now, you can't really sell it. You could use it for your own use. But if we're going to advocate energy crops, which I think we should, then we really need to try and influence policy.
Thanks, Mike. We're running right up on 2 o'clock here. If there are any last-minute questions, please feel free to type them in the chat pod. But in the meantime, Mike, do you have any sort of last-minute, final thoughts you want to leave us with today?
No, I just want to thank everyone for attending. I think there's a lot of interest in this area, especially when you see 95,000 acres being bandied about. There's a lot of room for work and building. I think some demonstration sites to show this can work is a good thing to do. And trying to show these synergies between water quality, bioenergy, and agriculture is what I wanted to get across. So thanks for attending.
Thank you so much, Mike. For those of you who are on the webinar,